Good morning. Welcome back. Great to see you. Thousands of people. I love it. It's just each of you counts as 1,000. You understand? That's how important you are to me. So, it's always quality. That's my opinion. Quality over quantity. But anyway, thanks for being here. If you're watching the calendar, you know that we meet today. We meet one more week. Next week, then we're done for the rest of the summer, come back in the fall. And at that point, we're going to finish, Lord willing, the Gospel of John. We're roughly halfway through at this point. If my preparation works out well, we should be able to get through the rest of it by next year. If any of you are curious, I am planning to do something after John. My ambition is to get all of the New Testament done. And so far what's left are what are called the encyclical letters. James we've done, that's one of them. 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude are the other encyclicals. So we'll spend a year probably doing those, and then the only thing left is the Gospel of Matthew. And I've put off Matthew because for years I felt, as I was in the shadow of the great internationally renowned Dale Bruner, who used to stand right here and teach Matthew, taught it multiple times in this very room. And so I've kind of felt like the ground was too holy. But we're past that now, so I'm just going to plow right in. So Lord willing, that will probably be about a 3-year project that I'm projecting out there. And if that all comes to pass, by that time I will be just about 80. Now, I don't know, what do you do when you're 80 years old?
You keep going.
You keep going. Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. I was not sure if there's a forced retirement age, in terms of being Sunday school teachers, but at least at this point, I'm planning to just keep cranking along, so we'll see what happens then. But that's as far out as my long-range planning has taken us at this point. But right now we're still in John. We're in John chapter 9. Just started a conversation about chapter 9 last week, and it's the 6th of the 7 signs that John describes for us. The 7th of them, of course, raising Lazarus from the dead. You might say that's kind of the ultimate expression of the power of Christ among us. But this one is not far from it. Healing a man who had been blind from birth. Not exactly your everyday occurrence. And of course, to the man who was himself blind from birth, an astonishing, indeed staggering renovation of his life. But the reason John includes it and builds so much narrative around it is because he lets it stand for an exposition of what Jesus said to us in chapter 8, namely, I'm the light of the world. And if Jesus is the light of the world, then the metaphor at least suggests we need to have eyes to see it. And Jesus now opens the eyes of a man so he can see this one who is indeed the light of the world. But as John tells the story in chapter 9, he wants us to recognize that not everybody has open eyes. And so even though the miracle is staggering, and certainly everybody who's there knows the truth of what happened, for some it draws them more deeply into faith, while for others it hardens them in their hatred. It's an important point for us to understand. Miracles do not convert people. Miracles without grace only cause people to become more entrenched in their hostility to God. They hate Him more intelligently in the face of a miracle. However, miracles mixed with grace certainly do draw people because the heart has been changed and Christ becomes attractive thereby. And there's no chapter I'm aware of that drives that point home more emphatically and more dramatically than chapter 9 of John's Gospel. We're going to be covering about 30 verses this morning. I'm entitling this, Once I Was Blind, Now I See, for obvious reasons. That's the critical text. Jesus does not make an appearance today in the entire narrative, so we can cover a little more ground, because the thing that tends to slow us down is Jesus. he shows up and says hard things, and we have to stop and puzzle over it and think about what does it mean. But now we're just going to run into human beings who are reacting in a almost predictable fashion. And so we can move a little faster, but I think we'll probably see ourselves portrayed in this story as it unfolds. So we'll take it one paragraph at a time, starting in chapter 9, verse 8. We'll take the first few verses and just, as I say, nibble through as we go along. So, Gospel of John, beginning at verse 8. This is the Word of God. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Isn't this the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It actually is him." But others said, no, it's his twin. It only looks like him. But he kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Well, how were your eyes opened?" And he answered, "Well, there was this fellow that came along, his name Jesus. He spit in the mud, he made some clay, he put it on my eyes, and he said to me, 'Go and wash in the pool of Siloam.' So I went and washed, and bam! I could see for the first time in my life. I could see everything. 2020, can you believe it? It was amazing." That's all in the Greek. They said to him, "Where is he?" And he said, "Beats me, I don't know." We're going to find an interesting growth in this man's understanding throughout this chapter, and that's one of the themes we want to keep our eyes on. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Our Father, we are so deeply grateful for such a story. Not only does it move us in wonder to simply think that you touched the eyes of a man who was born blind and made him see, but we immediately recognize ourselves in that story, because we know that as he came into this world blind, so did we in some deep sense. And the story reminds us that just as you touched his eyes, you touch ours. We pray that we would indeed be reminded of that, and that as a result of that, we would give the more glory and praise to Jesus, in whose name we ask these things. Amen. So, pretty predictable response. The neighbors, those who knew him, he was probably there at one of the major gates into the temple precincts. The most famous was called the Beautiful Gate, and it tended to be the place where people would gather who were in desperate need. So the blind, the lame, beggars, so on, would tend to be congregating in that area. It's the old theme that if you go to church, it softens you up, and then as you're walking out and you meet people in need, you're more likely to be generous. We have a little of that even here. You've experienced it in our downtown church. Well, something like that was going on. So this man was there as a regular. He was a recognized commodity, had been there probably for years, and the neighbors, the people who were acquainted with him, recognized this fellow, can now see, and of course they are asking the obvious question. This probably took place the next day. Remember, this happened in the evening of the prior day, the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a kind of lighting ceremony celebrating the light that the people of God had in the wilderness when they wandered there 40 years, the pillar of fire. And this was a reminder of it, and now Jesus, coming on the scene in that context, says, "I'm the light of the world." Basically pointing out that he is the realization of what that Old Testament narrative had anticipated, and now, as if to dramatize it, he gives sight to this individual. So the man was well known, and this is taking place probably the morning of the next day. So some were saying, this is the same guy. Look at him, you can tell it is. And others were saying it can't be the same guy. Who could possibly have been responsible for opening his eyes? And he's emphatically, pounding an, "I am this man, I'm the one," trying to settle the dispute. Who can argue with his personal account? He was the one who had gone through this. And so they asked the obvious question, well, how did this happen? This is not the kind of thing that happens every day. This is an astonishing change. How could it possibly be that you who were born blind can now see? You can imagine the staggering character of such a thing. And he answered as best he knew. pretty limited understanding, but he told the truth as far as he grasped it. There was this fellow, a man named Jesus. He made mud. He spit in the mud. He made clay. He put it on my eyes. He gave me a command, go to Siloam and wash. I went and I washed. And when the mud came off, what a spectacular. It's really nice to be able to see, wow, you've been enjoying this all your lives, and here he is for the first time. But notice all he can say of Jesus is he's a man with a name. What we're going to find as the story unfolds is that the elevation of Jesus in the man's understanding is a steady theme. So he becomes then a prophet. We'll see that a little later. He's going to become later on the Son of Man, a little higher elevation. Finally, he's going to become God himself. And we know that because John tells us that when he finally has a full understanding of this one who healed him, he falls down and worships. Non-deity should not accept worship, and there's no rebuke. It's an acceptance of worship. The only way that can happen is if indeed this is God among us. It's one more time that John is going to beat the drum that we're not dealing with anything less than absolute eternal deity in the second person of the Trinity walking among us as a man. So it really is quite an ascending, escalating estimate that we have here. I just want to point out to you, sort of in passing, that the man has a unique story, and one commentator said the testimony would be, I went, I washed, I saw. It reminded me of Julius Caesar, Vini, Vidi, Vici. You know that little expression, right? I came, I saw, I conquered. Well, that wasn't quite this, but it was something like that. I went, I washed, I saw. Not many people in history have quite that testimony. I grew up a Baptist. We always had Sunday night or Wednesday night prayer meeting. How many of you ever had prayer meetings? Okay, that's right, Prayer meeting. And I'm going to tell you, my folks were very inflexible about prayer meeting. I thought, but all my friends were there. We had youth groups, so we had a fun time. But anyway, the testimonials we would always have. Somebody would stand up and give a testimony, and I gave a few myself when I was a kid. And this is this man's testimony. I never heard anyone give this testimony in my little Baptist church way back when. Heard some great stories. This one is unique, but it gives me the opportunity to say to you, my beloved friends, you have a unique testimony, don't you? You have a story that nobody else in the world has. It is yours. And you should never be shy about sharing your testimony. I loved a quote from Matthew Henry. I had never come across this quote till I was preparing for this lecture, but it's a thought that's occurred to me a few times, and probably you too. Matthew Henry says, the wisdom and power of providence in ordering such a universal variety of the faces of men and women, so that no two are so alike, but that they may be distinguished, which is necessary to society and commerce and the administration of justice. He just makes that point in passing. But have you ever, what do we got? We have two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. I mean, how many different ways can you arrange those elements? And yet I have no trouble distinguishing every one of you in this room, and if there were thousands in this room, we could distinguish all. Isn't it amazing that God can be so creative with so little, such that every one of us is a distinct face, and you look at the billions in the world, and they're all distinct. If that's true of our face, how much more is it true of our story? Jesus said, you will receive power. John highlighted this in the sermon this morning, an excellent point. He said it well, and I'm just repeating what he said. You will receive power. And the power is to be a witness, a martyria. The word was used originally to refer to people who would speak under oath in court to what they had seen. They tell their story. I was on a certain street corner at a certain time, and I saw this, and That's what a martyria is. It doesn't require being a theologian. It doesn't require having advanced degrees, being an apologetical genius. None of that. It just requires having been there and having a story to tell about how Christ has reached you. This man had a story, a rather remarkable one, but we all have remarkable stories, and so let's not be shy about sharing them. Well, anyway, okay, we're good. So they say to him, well, where is this man, this fellow who did this remarkable thing? He says, I don't know. Beats me. There is much more ignorance at this point than knowledge, even in the man who's been healed. But as we said, his knowledge will gradually increase. Well, what to do? This is a breathtaking, miraculous event. And it seems like the best thing to do is to bring this man to the religious scholars, the religious sophisticates, and have them somehow explain what's going on. And so the people who best qualified for that would be the Pharisees. He's not being brought to them necessarily as religious authorities in the sense of political authority, but certainly religious authority. And hopefully he can shed some light on the situation. So they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had formerly been blind. Now, it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened the eyes, and John wants us to not forget that. That's a bit of a subtlety in the previous chapter, but just to make sure we don't miss the point, because it's critical to the unfolding story. So it was the Sabbath. The Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. So he said to them, well, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, as they were deliberating this interesting account, this man cannot be from God, because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. But others said, yeah, but how can a man who is a sinner do these signs? And there was a division among the Pharisees. So they said again to the blind man, well, what do you say about him? It's your eyes that he opened. And the man said, he's a prophet. A little bit more advanced view there. Well, they come to the Pharisees. These are the recognized experts. The man is growing in faith, and what we're going to see highlighted is while he is growing in faith, they are growing in hardness. Now, we know some indeed ask the right question. How can a man do something like this if he is in fact out of whack with God? Doesn't this sort of suggest that God must be with him? I imagine Nicodemus was one of those voices there. He's a Pharisee. He probably is saying, excuse me, gentlemen, but you know, a sign like this does suggest that God must be. Maybe we should rethink our view of things. Nicodemus had said to Jesus himself, no man can do these signs unless God is with him. You know, it just seems to follow. If you can go around giving sight to people who were born blind, we should be thinking about that and asking ourselves, maybe we need to adjust our understanding, maybe a little bit, but for the most part, the critical mass of opinion among the Pharisees went against the tide of Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, probably some others who were there as well, a small handful who were really arguing for a different perspective. It was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. John doesn't want us to miss it. It's an intentional act by Jesus. He didn't accidentally do this on the Sabbath. He is, in some sense, picking a fight. He knows it's controversial. It's precisely why he does it. Within the time frame that he does it, he wants to smoke out. I just lost myself. Well, can you all hear me? I'll just speak up, and I don't know. You want to see if you can hunt down. So he wants to get myself back here. We're okay. No, that's okay. That's okay. All right. It's an intentional act by Jesus. Back on script. Here I am. All right. And the reason is because Jesus so inclines to do things on the Sabbath is because there's going to be a deep adjustment of the Sabbath. Jesus says, of course, sometime later, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. He makes that. But repeatedly, the events that take place on the Sabbath are supposed to make us rethink it. Now, we know in the Old Testament, the Sabbath is the fourth commandment. And we know that the people were required, and it was quite a heavy duty that they had to observe the Sabbath and to not do work on the Sabbath. But as the writer to the Hebrews emphasizes, in spite of that rule, the people in the Old Covenant era never entered His rest. That's actually in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, but the writer to the Hebrews emphasizes it and says then, see, I think it's a heresy detector.
I think it's dead.
Ah, it's dead. But this man can raise it to life. You know? And on the Sabbath, tell you. Well, the writer to the Hebrews says, quoting and kind of triangulating several texts from the Old Testament, these words, there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Thank you.
Let's turn it off. All right.
You are the man. Give this man a hand. I mean, you know, he just... Yeah, I don't know. I pushed some buttons randomly, you know.
Yeah.
I tried to mess it up, but,
Okay.
you know. Whenever things don't work, I panic and just go... All right, so the writer of the Hebrews says, there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God, based on his premise that in the Old Covenant, though they had the fourth commandment, they never entered God's Sabbath. And in a sense, they could not enter his Sabbath until, in a sense, the work was completed. So Jesus pays the atoning price, and then in the last legitimate Sabbath in the history of the world, he rested on that Saturday. He was crucified Friday, laid to rest, took a day off, and on Sunday morning he rose to inaugurate what we call the New Covenant era. Embryonic, to be sure, but that's precisely what the author to Hebrews wants us to understand. Today is the day to enter his Sabbath. This is our Sabbath, whatever day of the week it may be. Now, we meet on Sundays. The New Testament hints in that direction. It's right that we should. It's fine. But we're also warned in the New Testament about esteeming one day better than another, as if it had some kind of independent, sacred status, as opposed to the day that we live in right now, which is the day to enter his rest. We're resting in the completed work of Christ. The Old Covenant Sabbath was simply a shadow by which we could anticipate that great day of the completed work of the atonement. And the book of Hebrews really hammers that, especially chapters 3 and 4. So Jesus, almost to set us up for that, will do these things on the Sabbath, just to loosen the mortar a little bit and get us to understand that maybe the fixation that had been attached to the Sabbath needed to be adjusted a little bit in connection with life under the New Covenant era. So, not surprisingly, this took place on the Sabbath, which is, as I say, kind of a silhouette of the stupendous work of Christ that would open the door to a true Sabbath rest for all of us. Well, the Pharisees, of course, didn't quite catch the nuances of that. They grab onto this man and they ask him again, how did he open your eyes? What magic did he do? What incantations did he say? Give us the details. And so he gives this rather pedestrian response. He put mud in my eyes and I washed and I see. The imperfect in the Greek is being used here, which suggests a kind of police interrogation. I don't know if you've ever been through this. But my understanding by watching cop shows on TV is that They keep asking you to tell us one more time, just tell us one more time, from the top, and keep peppering, hoping the poor suspect is going to trip up, contradict himself, get the story mixed up, something like that. That's kind of the hope. And you almost get the feeling these people are police interrogators. They got the bright lights on, shining into his eye. Now tell us one more time just exactly how this happened. Notice the response now is a little different than it was the first time. The first time he talked about making the mud and so on. Now it's a little more adroit. I think he sees the threat that's brewing in the minds of these Pharisees, so he doesn't say anything that would be a technical violation of the Sabbath. Well, he just put mud on my eyes. That's okay on the Sabbath. He told me to go and wash. Well, it was within a Sabbath day's journey. That was okay. And my eyes were opened. So even this man is kind of beginning to be a little bit of a defender of Jesus. You can almost sense a little subtlety along those lines. Well, the Pharisees said, this man can't be from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath. Others, Nicodemus among them probably, well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? There's a division of opinion. It is sometimes called, you might say philosophically, the split between form and substance. Some people are incurable formalists. They want all the form to be correct, and usually people who are legalistically inclined with a kind of very formalistic view of life are very good at drawing lines. Drawing lines, it's an expertise of line drawing. Line drawing has to do with boundaries and borders. The presupposition behind a line is you can be on the right side of the line or the wrong side of the line. And a line is there to say to you, you can go this far, but no further. It's a limiting thing. Grace, on the other hand, has a very different kind of orientation to life. Grace is about what can I do without limit. The Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians, lists off the fruit of the Spirit, and he says, against such there is no law. You can be as loving as you want. You can be as giving as you want. There's no law. There's, oh, I'm sorry, you're being too loving here. We're going to have to draw the line. No, you don't do that. Jesus says, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. He's the first guy in human history to say that. Confucius said something like it, but it was line drawing. Don't do anything to others that you wouldn't want them to do to you, you see. That's a legalistic perspective. That says, here's where you draw the line. Jesus won't have that. He says, go out there and be the most robust, generous, out-of-control, reckless giver you can imagine. You can't outgive God. You just go for it. There's no laws there. Against such there is no law. That's the difference between law and grace. It's the difference between that which engenders pride based on the work I'm doing and that which is born of the humility that is at the heart of faith. Faith is, at its core, humility. If I'm proud of my faith, Houston, we have a problem, you see. Faith is, at its core, recognizing I've just received boundless benefits I did not deserve from a very generous deity who should have given me wrath. And in fact, He's overwhelmed me with His goodness. If we really get that, then it really does give birth within us to a deeply humble appreciation. And that's the heart of faith. Line drawing tends to make me proud of my expertise, proud of how good I'm being, staying on the right side. It creates all the wrong things within me. Well, they again said to the man who's blind, well, what do you say about him? You know, it's your eyes that he opened. And he said, he's a prophet. So we have this elevation of his official opinion of Jesus now. Oddly enough, here's the experts asking the opinion of the non-expert in the room, and he gives this rather elevated response. Jesus is certainly a prophet. He is certainly not less than a prophet, but he is infinitely more than a prophet. So we would say being a prophet is a lesser included of the package of reality that we find in Jesus. A prophet is one who speaks for God. Jesus was God who speaks. And insofar as he was God who speaks, we could say he was speaking for God, speaking for himself among us, speaking for the Father among us. That makes him a prophet for sure, but certainly there was more growth to be happening here beyond that affirmation. Well, the Jews didn't believe that the one who had been blind had received his sight. They don't believe it. Now notice we have a change. It was originally the Pharisees, kind of keep your eye on this, but now it's the Jews, and we've mentioned before many times, the Jews in John's Gospel stand for the religious brass, and there's the implication of authority. The Pharisees didn't have any authority as such, except kind of a moral authority associated with their religious expertise. The Jews actually had a certain degree of law-making authority. They can promulgate rules that will actually be enforced with the backup of Rome. That was a little different, and so now that John slips that in, and we don't want to miss it. So the Jews who were there in the room as well, and now more or less speaking in their authoritative capacity, did not believe that the one who had been blind had received his sight. They just didn't believe it. They thought this has to be cooked up, some kind of attempt to deceive or delude or an illusion or something. They're trying to run some sort of scam here to get some sort of following. That's what they're thinking. They're thinking like politicians, you know. They didn't believe that the one who's blind had received his sight until they called the parents. Let's get the mom and dad in here, see what they have to say. So they bring in the mom and dad, and they ask them, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Well, now you tell us, how does he now see?" You can see where this is going, you know. These poor parents. The parents answer, okay, we know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. Can you imagine the tragedy the day this child was born? Can you imagine the tears? Every parent hopes that, you know, they're going to have a healthy kid, and if it doesn't turn out that way, then, you know, if you're a Christian, you take that as a blessing. I have one granddaughter who's Down syndrome. Wouldn't change her for the world because she's so wonderful, but we all have a little disappointment. We know that feeling. We're all human enough to experience it. You can imagine what these folks went through on the day of that child's birth. I'm sure there was a little weeping, but there was probably some trust. They knew that this young man, as he grew up, was going to be a dependent. There was no ADA out there, you know, for dependent or disabled Americans, anything like that. Nothing like that was on there. They knew he was just going to have to beg his way through life. So they could confirm this. There was no question about what had happened way back when. Also, they continue, how he now sees, we don't know. And who it is that opened his eyes. But look, he's an adult. He's a grown-up. You can ask him. He's of age. He'll tell you his own story. And we might think that's a little bit rude on the part of the parents to kind of deflect back to their son. But John gives us the parenthetical remark here, which helps us understand it. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. These are the authorities. They have the power to make your life hurt, you know. For the Jews had already agreed and apparently promulgated a rule that if anyone should publicly confess Jesus is Messiah, he was to be ejected from the synagogue. There is a unique Greek word. We might translate it roughly or say it roughly, de-synagogued. Synagogue is at the root of the word. He will be cast out of the synagogue. That was a big deal. Therefore, his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So here are these skeptical religious authorities. They don't believe that this miracle could have taken place as advertised, couldn't be this way, so they call in the parents. They think it must be a hoax. They're hoping to prove maybe that the parents were in on it. Maybe the parents are part of the collusion team that's trying to cook up this little subterfuge, and so they're going to smoke this deal out. They're going to get these parents to confess. And so they ask the questions. You say your son was born blind, so tell us now, how is it that he sees, you know? hoping to get them to somehow trip up and admit their part in this. So the parents say what they know. We know that this is our son. We recognize him, fingerprints, everything good. We know that he was born blind. We remember that very well, no question about that. They can say what they know. They are going to disclaim and deflect what they don't know. How it is that he now sees, we don't know. Who it is that opened his eyes, we don't know. But ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. Emphasis slightly on the second clause. We don't know. He can speak for himself. And then John gives us this remark. His parents said these things because they were afraid of the Jewish authorities. For they had said already that if anyone publicly said out there in the streets, Jesus is Messiah, he's Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. It's like a misdemeanor, but it could have some rather sobering consequences. Excommunication, being desynagogued, could take three forms. There was a 7-day suspension. There was a 30-day renewable suspension, which would be sort of like serving time on good behavior. And if you were a good person, then the suspension would be lifted, otherwise it could be renewed. And the most serious of all was a lifetime ejection. All right. So they didn't know which of those was necessarily waiting for them if they broke the rules here, but any one of them could be somewhat devastating. To be excommunicated in any of those forms would, number one, require a public trumpet blast. You'd have a kind of an official gathering there in the public square. A trumpet sounds, kind of giving some sort of official weight to the whole thing. The person would be identified, name, address, all of that, and they were now to be shunned, which was something on the order of saying being treated as if they were dead. They were also to be, even worse than that, regarded as a leper, treated as if they were unclean. They were no longer to have free access to public byways and highways and so on. Especially, they were shut out of the marketplace. They could walk in with a bunch of money, but the money would not be good, at least unless it was under the table and very secret, because anyone who would take money from someone who was excommunicated would that person themselves become exposed to criminal behavior of some sort. So the whole thing, of course, was richly to be avoided, and that's what these parents were very much worried about, that if they were to somehow go crosswise with these religious authorities, that might be very much the consequence that would befall them. So, John explains, the parents said, he's of age, ask him. I think they probably thought even if he got de-synagogued, they'd still make sure he was okay. He didn't starve to death in the streets, but they're trying not to get themselves in that much trouble, so they're trying to play this as best they know how. So anyway, that brings us now to I'm going to call this strike three. They've tried to get the man to admit or contradict himself. That didn't work. They've tried to get it out of the parents. That didn't work. Now they're going to call this man in, and they're going to up the ante a little bit in their interrogation of him. So for the second time, they called the man who'd been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God." Now, in that setting, that was comparable to saying, put your hand on the Bible, swear an oath, you are now going under penalty of perjury to say to us what's going on. So it was adding weight and indeed legal exposure to this fellow in terms of what testimony he might give at this point. So that was the kind of the technical force of give glory to God. We elite, we experts with PhDs after our names who are very smart and very educated, we happen to know, as opposed to you, that this man is a sinner. We know it. We can say it with certainty. So, what do you have to say for yourself? And he answered, look, whether he's a sinner, I don't know. There's one thing I know, and that is this. Once I was blind, now I see. That's what I know. Simple story, hard to argue with it. They said to him, well, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Come on, well, it has to be more than mud and spit. He answered, I've told you already. You keep refusing to listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? You know? So for a second time, they call him, give glory to God, swear on a Bible. We know that he couldn't do this. We know it didn't happen because we happen to know it couldn't happen. I had a case once, jury trial. That was kind of the crux of my argument. I was saying that the defense in this case is arguing this accident didn't happen because it couldn't happen. But in fact, my friends, I said to the jury, it did happen. Therefore, QED, it could happen. I still lost the case. I'm telling you, it was really a sad day in River City, but you know, those things happen. There was more to it than that, but that was at least part of my argument. Anyway, that's kind of the way they're approaching this. You know, we know this couldn't happen. They were trying to overawe the guy. I mean, here they are, these incredibly well-educated, smart, brilliant people, and they're trying to scare him into just collapsing, I guess, beneath the weight of their powerful presence and so on, and just deny what he apparently knew to be true. It seems to be what's going on. And of course, he gives, once again, a very truthful answer. Whether he's a sinner, I don't know. The only thing I know is once I was blind, now I see. We were saying a little earlier that we all have a unique story, and we certainly do. But at least at one point, our stories, though they may vary widely one from another, have a common denominator that unites them. We can all say in some sense or other, with respect to our connection to Jesus, once I was blind, now I see. Now I grant you, for me, I think it was when I was about 4 years old. So I was a 4-year-old reprobate. But once I was blind, now I see. But it's still, we're always impressed when adults who've had such a hardcore, difficult, challenging life, sinful stuff, criminal behavior, and so on, and then they come resolutely, dramatically to faith in Christ. What a wonderful thing that is. I wouldn't want to trade places with them, though. You know, I kind of like having grown up in a place of faith. But whatever your story may be, that or anything in between, we can all still say with sobriety, once I was blind, now I see. That's what unites us, that Jesus has opened our eyes, and that's what this man can say. One commentator who was musing on this verse was reflecting on the Wesleyan revivals. You know, when George Whitefield was preaching in the colonies, John Wesley was the centerpiece of a great revival that was taking place in England. And so there was a colonial Great Awakening, but also an English Great Awakening at roughly the same time. And he was reporting this story. A man converted in the Wesleyan revivals, being chided by his fellow workers, "You don't really think that Jesus turned water into wine, do you?" The man answered, "You know, I don't know if Jesus actually changed water into wine. I wasn't there. I do know this. In my house, Jesus turned beer into furniture." You know. Okay, that's a testimony. And that's what we can say. Maybe we're not so sure if Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Okay, we can, you know, reflect on that one way or another, have our debates. But one thing I know in my life, this is what happened. And that really is the most compelling story we can tell. And in some ways, it's the story he's telling. Well, they answer, well, you know, what did he do to you? How did he do this? What's the magic trick that was involved here? Probably still trying to trip him up. He answers, look, I've told you again and again, already you can kind of see the police interrogation mood of this. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples as well? A little cheeky, I agree, sort of rising temperature in the room, I suppose. Interesting little implication when he says, do you also want to become his disciple? As if now this man has moved another notch, hasn't he? He's not simply observing and admiring Jesus from afar, He's a prophet, but now, do you also want to be his disciple? He's kind of beginning to include himself in that classification. Well, they reviled him, saying, "We are disciples of Moses. You're that man's disciple." That's kind of the way it reads. "We know that God has spoken to Moses. As for that man, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "That's kind of amazing. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he miraculously opened my eyes, and you're clueless." That's kind of a showstopper, isn't it? Now, we know this is the man, unsophisticated, uneducated, basically a professional beggar up until the previous day, can say, lecturing the scholars, "We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind." No record of that in the Old Testament ever. This is a brand new, unprecedented event. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, "You are riffraff, you're rabble, you were born in sin, you're worthless, you're scum, and you're going to stand here and lecture us?" And they gave him the boot. The word is ekbalo. It's not to be desynagogued, so I don't think it means he was kicked out of the synagogue. It takes more of an official proceeding, but they did just kick him out of the meeting. They'd had enough of this fellow. You're his disciple. We're disciples of Moses. I think it's interesting that these who claim to be disciples of Moses either forgot or were ignoring one of the most well-known predictions of Moses, Deuteronomy 18:18, that someday a prophet would come greater than Moses and that they should listen to him. Moses predicted that. You think it might have occurred to these guys, I wonder if this is the guy. I wonder if this is he just opened the eyes of someone born blind. Maybe we should give him a second glance. But no. They're so proud of their status that they won't even entertain that possibility. So fearful of losing their prestige in the community that they're not willing to actually entertain the possibility that the greatest thing in human history is now just dropped into their laps, and they are witnessing it, and they could be the great enthusiastic embracers of it. No. They're more worried about keeping their cozy, comfortable relationship to the authorities and their kind of privileged status in the community to even entertain the thought. "We know," they said, "that God spoke through Moses. As for this man, we don't even know where he came from," ignoring this greater prophet that Moses predicted himself. So the man gives a little lecture. This is really an amazing thing. You don't know where he comes from, which is tantamount to saying you don't know who he is. Your origins sometimes informed your identity, And yet he came along and does this astonishing miracle, opening my eyes. You scholars, nevertheless, are clueless. And you can kind of see the man's estimate of Jesus rising even a little bit more. Again, Matthew Henry says, "There are many who pass for learned and knowing men." By the way, Matthew Henry wrote in the 18th century. I think you know that, but I'll mention it. Learned and knowing men who understand business, can talk sensibly in other things, who yet are ignorant to a wonder of the doctrine of Christ, who have no concern, no, not so much as a curiosity to acquaint themselves with that which even angels desire to look into. You know people, and so do I, intelligent, successful, well-adjusted people, you would think, who just don't have quite enough time yet to consider the central event of human history. They just have some other things to get done first. Just, maybe I'll get to it one of these days. But I've got deals to make right now. I'm a busy guy. You think, how do we account for that? These people, you would think if anybody in the history of the world would have been astute and aware of what was happening in their very midst, it would have been these. These were the scholars. And yet even they are blinded. We're born blind. If God gives us sight, we can see. Jesus will eventually say to this very blind man, we'll see it next week, on the other hand, I came into this world so those who think they see will be confirmed in their blindness. Well, this man continuing his lecture now, we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Who is the we? First person plural pronoun here. We know. This is the blind man speaking. Maybe he's speaking in a sense that we all in this room, but I rather think, and commentators tend to agree, that he means we normal people. We who sort of see life without all of the lenses of too much scholarship. Festus said to Paul, much learning has made you mad. There is a little truth to that. All due respects to the well-educated in the room, which is all of you, I know that. But you know that sometimes you can just look at things a little too closely and miss the forest for the trees. We're capable of doing that. We all are aware of that. And I think this man is speaking in a sense for, you might say, the theology in a sense of every man. We know certain things. We just know certain things have got to be true. We know that if somebody goes around doing stupendous miracles, raising the dead, giving sight to the blind, healing the lepers, we know that should probably be a good clue that we should listen to what he's saying a little more carefully than we might just be dismissive of him. Martin Luther, of course, is famous for many reasons, but some people say, and with some degree of credibility, that the most influential thing Martin Luther ever did was translate the Bible into vernacular German. Up until then, it was basically illegal to read the Bible except in an official Latin, which nobody could read unless you were sort of a well-educated religious elite type. And the Bible was intentionally kept out of circulation at the popular level. Of course, the Bible in German became an overnight bestseller. Everybody was talking about it. William Tyndale had a similar experience. Again, the Bible was fundamentally illegal in England, but the Tyndale Bible, in a lapse of judgment, I would say on Henry VIII's part, I mean that ironically, said, okay, go ahead, distribute the Tyndale Bible. And within a year, everybody was talking about the content of that Bible. Same thing in Germany. They were arguing about it in the beer houses. They were having conversation. Well, yeah, but this verse says that, and how can you do that? And Luther was warned by the Catholic Church, don't you know you're going to open chaos here? And Luther said, well, maybe a little bit of that. But Luther endorsed a principle that he called the perspicuity of the Scripture, which fundamentally means, he said, that the Scriptures are sufficiently plain and clear that a person of ordinary literate ability can read them and get it. There's obscure texts, we all know that. That's why people get PhDs. But for the most part, the Bible is pretty straightforward. And if you can read the morning newspaper, you can read the Bible and make pretty good heads or tails out of what it's saying. It's like, Mark Twain's famous line, it's not the parts of the Bible I don't understand that bother me, it's the parts I do understand that bother me, a little of that. There's a plainness, an almost pedestrian quality to a lot of the Bible that, you just can get it. And Luther believed that, and he believed that even if there were differences of opinion, the general understanding would gradually be illuminated by popular conversation about it. And in some ways, this man saying, we know, is kind of reflecting the average, normal guy's understanding of the truth of God that you don't need to be an advanced scholar to really get, Never since the world began, this man says, has it been heard that anybody opened the eyes of a man born blind. It was unprecedented, as we said. It should be irrefutable proof of God's work. If this man, he concludes, were not from God, he could do nothing. He couldn't do the tiniest miracle, let alone one of this stupendous quality. But of course, their hatred blinds them. It is such a sobering thought, isn't it? I just want you to think about that. Here are highly intelligent, well-educated people. There's no delusion going on. They have now got sufficient credible evidence to know that Jesus touched the eyes of a man born blind and bam, he could see. Don't you think that that should persuade anybody to bow the knee and come to faith? But unless grace is there, the heart only hardens. Jesus said, telling the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, if they don't simply believe the Bible because the Bible says it, they won't believe even if somebody rises from the dead. Miracles won't do it. They will not move the hostility of the human heart. So if you love Jesus, thank Jesus. That was an astonishing gift. Unless a man is born again, he cannot see. We don't give birth to ourselves. We don't heal ourselves. We were born dead. It's Christ who does this great, astonishing work in us, just as he did with this man. Well, they answered him, of course, with nothing but insults. You were born in sin. You're just worthless scum. You're a rabble. Who do you think you are lecturing us? And they gave him the boot, and out he goes. And the only paragraph left in this chapter is the one we'll cover next week, a little bit more slowly, because now Jesus shows up. We don't have to slow down when Jesus says things, but what he says, of course, has such power that it is certainly an appropriate place for us to wind up our studies this year. So one more next week, but for now, some thoughts about what we've just covered. A reminder, your story is unique, a powerful proof of the reality of Christ and his work of grace. People can raise all kinds of objections and all kinds of, problems and inconsistencies and all the stuff that you've all been around the block a few times, you know how that goes. But there's no safer ground when you're having a conversation with someone who lacks faith. No safer ground to simply tell what you know. Don't try to be something you're not. What you know the best, better than anyone in the world, is your story. The Apostle Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, and 2 more times Luke basically reports to us that Paul just told the story. He just told the story. Now, he had a lot more he could say, and sometimes he did. But really, his safe ground in talking with people who were hostile to him, well, I was on the road to Damascus one day, and I was going to arrest a bunch of Christians, and the heavens lit up, and Jesus of Nazareth asked me why I was persecuting him. It's hard to argue with that, you see. And in some ways, you have a similar story. It may not be that dramatic, but it's certainly that credible because it's your story. Second, your message shares a common theme with everybody else's. Once I was blind, now I see. If you're a Christian believer, in some sense or other, you know you can say that. You can say, once I was blind, now I see. I've told you before, I won't take any time just to remind you of it. A disc jockey friend of mine I had years ago here in Spokane, back in the 70s. He was considered a blue disc jockey. He was on the edge all the time with off-color humor. Actually got in trouble a little bit. He came to faith in Christ in such a dramatic reversal of his life that it was an astonishment to everybody he knew, including me. And to this day, he is a firebrand of testament to Christ. It changed him radically. You would never in a million years convince him that it was just a little change of opinion on his part. He knew he had been run over by a steamroller called grace, and it left him a different guy, and he's been a different guy ever since, you know. Well, he could simply say, once I was blind and now I see, but he has his own little, additional elements that he can add to that story, as do you. Finally, even though all we can do is tell our story, it should be rooted in the truth of Scripture. So, just like Luther translates the Bible into German or Tyndale into English and so on, we need to be ingesters of the Scripture. Your confidence rests in the Word of God. Your confidence in your story is rooted in the truth of the Scriptures, which give you an explanation of your story, namely God's sovereign grace in your work. So your confidence rests in the Word of God, brought home to you personally by the Spirit of Christ. So never divorce your story from the Scriptures. Read them, believe in the perspicuity of the Scriptures, make sense out of them, get them into your bloodstream, let the Word of God dwell in you richly, and that infuses your story with, of course, the very ballast of God Himself speaking through your testimony. Feeney, I'd love to hear from you. We got a late start, so I'm not apologizing for the time, but it's 20 after. If you need to head out, that's fine. But I'd love to have a thought, feedback, question, debate, footnote, application, personal story. Going once? Please. Laura tells us, the irony of this is really astonishing, isn't it? That here's a man who was blind lecturing people who think they see, and they're the ones that are really the blind ones. And that's what Jesus will say. That's kind of the punchline of the conversation next week. I came into the world so that those who were blind could see, and those who see or think they see would be made blind, and it's really true. Thank you for that, yes. And this is very helpful. Karen is noting how, as varied as we do have that common root. It all starts in that great moment of grace. Jesus prays in the so-called high priestly prayer in chapter 17, may they be one, may they be one. As we are one, and usually when I hear commentators or preachers or whatever refer to that, they talk about how far short we have fallen. We should be one, and we got 1,000 different denominations. They kind of beat up on the church for that, and okay, maybe there's some merit to that complaint, but in some ways there is deep truth to it as well. I've met Christian believers who were Methodist, who were Presbyterian, who were Catholic, who were, and somehow you have an almost immediate sense this person, though we may vary on some points, hey, it's good, clean fun. We have a little difference. You baptize adults, we baptize infants. I thought, okay, fine, we can have that conversation. But somehow down deep inside, we know we share something that is much more important than anything that divides us. I think Jesus' prayer was answered in that sense, that we have this kind of union in Him that unites us with true believers everywhere, throughout the world. Yeah, Keith. Keith says.
In their case, you can't refute it. Everything
that's
he
right.
provides,
That's right.
Yeah. So what do? They cast them out.
That's right.
Deny it.
Yeah.
Convince himself.
Yeah. Here's the original whistleblower. He should have been protected. Bam, get him out of here. We don't want to hear that story. No political comment intended, of course, but you understand the idea. Keith's point is that it's so astonishing that they can't deny the truth of it, so instead of bowing to the truth of it, they'll maintain the lie by getting rid of this truth speaker. That's a scary place to be, isn't it? We never find ourselves there. Anybody else?
Don't believe your lying eyes.
Don't believe your lying eyes. That's right. Good. All right. Thank you all. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Let's close in prayer. Our Father, we are deeply grateful that there was a man born blind so many years ago. And though there was probably some weeping on the day he was born, what rejoicing on the day that you opened his eyes. We thank you that we can similarly rejoice in the great miracle, maybe a greater miracle yet, that you opened our eyes. Remove the hostility, opened us to become those who deeply, sincerely, from the heart, follow Jesus. And we pray that we would be consistent in doing so, honoring his name. And for all of that, we give you thanks in Jesus' name.